Science fiction, the unparalleled adventure of one Hans Pfaall from 1835. What is the test for a science fiction story? The answer is the science in the story plausible. The science doesn't necessarily have to be factual, but it must be plausible. A definition of science fiction: prose narrative that could not arise in the world we know. It is unreal, but it has to be hypothesized on some scientific plausible basis. It doesn't have to be true. It's based on rational speculation, the effects of science on man. Good sci-fi concerns people socially, philosophically, and morally. The origins of science fiction are debated, but given the definition, one thing is necessary: applied science. Without some form of scientific analysis and technology, there can be no science fiction. So, as a result, science fiction really only starts to appear in the 19th century. Some critics, such as Carl Sagan and Isaac Asimov, consider Somnium, Latin for the dream, written between 1620 and 1630 in Latin by Johannes Kepler, to be the first science fiction work, but it is more of fantasy than science fiction. In the narrative, a student of Tycho Brahe is transported to the moon by occult forces. It presents a detailed, imaginative description of how the Earth might look when viewed from the moon, and is considered the first serious scientific treatise on lunar astronomy. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels and Voltaire's Micro-Méga both have sci-fi-like elements that include contact with aliens, but the focus of the work is on satire and social commentary. Following the 18th century development of the novel as a literary form, in the early 19th century, Mary Shelley's book Frankenstein helped define the form of the science fiction novel. Many argue that Frankenstein is the first science fiction novel, especially since the novel has scientific innovation and asks the question, can man create life? But my science fiction professor poo-pooed the idea, noting correctly that Frankenstein is first and foremost a Gothic romance. The science in the story is ancillary and not at all developed. Mary Shelley was not knowledgeable about science. In any case, most agree that Jules Verne and H.G. Wells were the first two serious science fiction writers, and we already have noted Poe's influence on Verne. Verne's From the Earth to the Moon appeared in 1865, only 16 years after Poe's death. So that leaves us with Poe writing science fiction, 3 stories decades before Verne. In Hans Pfaall, Poe explored the heavens. These explorations of space are his so-called science fictions, the genre he developed, some say invented, and bequeathed to a host of later, more successful writers, from Jules Verne to Ray Bradbury. Other science fiction stories: The Balloon Hoax, Melanta Tota, Some Words with a Mummy, were some of Poe's other stories. So does the story meet the criteria that science fiction must be scientifically plausible? Looking through the lenses of the 21st century, the answer would be clearly no. But if we look at the story through the lenses of the early 19th century and the lack of firm data regarding the atmosphere and the physics of outer space, the story becomes slightly more plausible. Poe, at least, attempts to account for the reader's disbelief, such as on page 975 to 982. 8:15, being no longer able to draw breath without the most intolerable pain, I proceeded forthwith to adjust around the car the apparatus belonging to the condenser. Poe then proceeds with a description of the condenser and how he was going to be able to breathe air all the way to the moon with the help of the invention of the water clock. In fact, the discussion about breathing becomes more important in the story as far as survival is concerned than eating, drinking, and once again that taboo subject of emptying one's bowels and bladder, which we notice was never mentioned in Arthur Gordon Pym either. The account of Hunn's balloon trip to the moon is Poe's sequel to the balloon hoax, which caused quite a stir. In 1831, he had the fortuitous notion of writing a supposed journal kept by a couple of aeronauts who inflate a balloon in Wales intending to land in Paris, but who are blown by a storm over the Atlantic to Sullivan's Island, South Carolina. This tale was actually taken seriously by the New York Sun, and for the day or so between the receipt of the report and a reply by post to the paper's request for confirming details from South Carolina, the balloon hoax was the talk of the town. Madame Bonaparte notes that Pfaall alludes to the German Pfaall, which means stake, stick, or picket, or pole, and the word prick or dick in slang, just as in some of these and similar words mean dick in English. Then, in a not-so-subtle comparison, Pfaall also sounds like the German phallus, which of course derives from the Latin phallus, and comes directly into English as phallus. Hans, of course, is a common name in German, derived from Johannes, or John in English, and is as common a name in Dutch and German as John is in English. And a John, of course, is a trick, a prostitute's customer. So here we have the unparalleled adventure of one John Prick. Poe's humor shows up throughout the story, which is not only reminiscent of Washington Irving's humor in the Knickerbocker History of New York, Irving being one of Poe's contemporaries, but also the sexual humor that we saw in Rabelais, Swift, and Sterne, as we discussed during our reading of Lionizing. Note the date of the publication, 1835, the same year that Poe wrote Lionizing. So clearly we are still in Poe's satire and humor phase of writing. So where do you see the humor in this story? This is a good journal topic. The story starts with a letter from Hans phrased as an appeal for pardon for his offense of killing in the explosion that launched his balloon 3 creditors who had been hounding him to death. Again, we see an example of humor in Irving's style. Page 960, note the launch date, April 1st, April Fool's Day. Then on page 961 to 962, I want to read aloud the launch. It was now nearly daybreak, and I thought it high time to take my departure. Dropping a lighted cigar on the ground, as if by accident, I took the opportunity, in stooping to pick it up, of igniting privately the piece of slow match, the end of which, as I said before, protruded a very little beyond the lower rim of one of the smaller casts. This maneuver was totally unperceived on the part of the 3 duns, and jumping into the car, I immediately cut the single cord which held me to the earth, and was pleased to find that I shot upward with inconceivable rapidity, carrying with all ease 175 pounds of leaden ballast and able to have carried up as many more. As I left the earth, the barometer stood at 30 inches and the centigrade thermometer at 19 degrees. Scarcely, however, had I attained the height of 50 yards when roaming and rumbling up after me in the most horrible and tumultuous manner came so dense a hurricane of fire and gravel and burning wood and blazing metal and mangled limbs that my very heart sunk within me, and I fell down to the bottom of the car, trembling with terror. Indeed, I now perceived that I had entirely overdone the business, and that the main consequences of the shock were yet to be experienced. Accordingly, in less than a second, I felt all the blood in my body rushing to my temples, and immediately thereupon a concussion, which I shall never forget, burst abruptly through the night and seemed to rip the very firmament asunder. When I afterward had time for reflection, I did not fail to attribute the extreme violence of the explosion as regarded myself to its proper cause, my situation directly above it and in the line of its greatest power. But at the time, I thought only of preserving my life. The balloon at first collapsed and then furiously expanded, then whirled around and round with horrible velocity, and finally, reeling and staggering like a drunken man, hurled me with great force over the rim of the car and left me dangling at a terrific height, with my head downward and my face outwards, with a piece of slender cord about 3 feet in length, which hung accidentally through a crevice near the bottom of the wickerwork, and in which, as I fell, my left foot became most providentially entangled. It is impossible, utterly impossible, to form any adequate idea of the horror of my situation. I grasped convulsively for breath. A shudder resembling a fit of the ague agitated every nerve and muscle of my frame. I felt my eyes starting from their sockets. A horrible nausea overwhelmed me, and at length I lost all consciousness in a swoon. What happened? He lit a keg of gunpowder to create a disturbance, but overdid it and ended up killing the 3 men and nearly himself. Despite the seriousness of the injuries, this is a highly comic description, slapstick almost, of his hanging from the basket. Does it remind you of anyone? Yes, The Wizard of Oz. L. Frank Baum was another author who was greatly influenced by Poe. The number of Poe's influences never ceases to amaze me. In consideration of the light which I have it in my power to throw upon many very important branches of physical and metaphysical science, I must solicit, through the influence of your honorable body, a pardon for the crime of which I have been guilty in the death of the creditors upon my departure from Rotterdam. We don't find out until the last page of the story that the whole purpose of the letter was to ask for a pardon. The device of the letter is used commonly in Poe's tales. It is a report or summons from the soul. As we go through the story, focus not on just the content of the story, but on how the story is written. What are its genres? I see a mixing of travel narrative and scientific treatise to newspaper story and imaginative tale, and of course, science fiction. Think about what effects the mixing of genres have on the plot and characters and on the reader. Other questions to think about. What are Pfaall's demands at the end of the letter? What does he promise in return? How do these demands affect the account of his voyage in the rest of the letter? How do the recipients of the letter react? What is the reasoning behind each of their reactions? What light do Poe's earlier writings about science shed on Professor Rubadub's response to Pfaall's letter? What can we make of Superbus von Unterduck and Professor Rubadub's humorous names? What is the public response to Pfaall's letter when it is published? Why do the people of Rotterdam react as they do? What is the narrator's attitude towards the public? What is his attitude towards Hans Pfaall?